Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, here to lead you through tonight's chilling journey. If you find these stories help you unwind or gently guide you to sleep, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. It truly helps bring more of these stories to you. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and the time where you are. It's always fascinating to connect with listeners around the world. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and prepare yourself for a night of mystery and suspense. It started innocently enough. I was browsing YouTube late at night, letting the algorithm take me down a rabbit hole of strange and obscure content. I'd just finished watching a true crime documentary when a peculiar thumbnail appeared in the recommendations. It was a black screen with the words, "Do you see me?" written in faint, almost invisible text. Curious, I clicked. The video was odd. It opened with a black screen, completely silent. I waited for something to happen, thinking it was maybe a build-up to some kind of jump scare or eerie story. But for the first minute, nothing changed. Then, very faintly, I heard a sound, like soft breathing, coming from somewhere far away. I felt an inexplicable chill. The breathing grew louder, as though someone were moving closer to the microphone, but no other visuals or narration appeared. Just the breathing, slow and steady. Against my better judgment, I clicked onto the channel's main page. It had no name, just a long string of random numbers and letters. The profile picture was black, and there were only 3 videos. Do you see me? Logically, keep watching, and are you alone? Each video had only a handful of views and no comments, like they were hidden in some obscure corner of the platform. I clicked on the second video, keep watching. This time there was no sound at all, just a black screen that stretched on for 10 minutes. But at the very end, for barely a second, I caught a glimpse of something. A pair of eyes, dark and unblinking, staring directly at the camera. I felt my stomach turn. Those eyes, they looked familiar, like they were watching me, specifically me. I closed the video, unnerved but unable to shake the feeling that I'd seen those eyes before, somewhere deep in my own memory. The third video, "Are you alone?" logically felt almost like a dare. It started the same way as the others, black screen and silence, but after a few seconds, a distorted voice came through. It was whispering, so faint that I could barely make out the words. "I can see you. I know you're watching." I shut my laptop, heart pounding, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I sat in my dim room, I realized I hadn't seen a reflection in my screen, even though it was entirely black. It was as though something had blocked my reflection, something standing behind me. I turned around, but of course no one was there. The room was empty. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining those eyes from the video, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to look away so they could get closer. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I opened my laptop and went back to YouTube, searching for the channel. But it was gone. Every trace of it had vanished. No name, no videos, nothing. I tried to tell myself it was a trick, some kind of elaborate prank. But every night since, I've felt it, the faint sense of being watched, like those eyes are still there, just beyond my vision, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves again. They say Hollowfield Farm was once a thriving place, full of life and laughter. Now it's only known for the stories, the kind that keep people from venturing too close, especially after dark. But on a dare from my friend Josh, I agreed to spend a night there. It was supposed to be a joke, a chance to prove to ourselves that we weren't afraid of some old, run-down farm. The moment we arrived, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the fields and making it feel as if we'd entered a world outside of time. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, its windows broken and walls crumbling, the remnants of what had once been someone's dream. There was an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the barn doors swinging in the wind. Josh and I walked up the gravel path, our flashlights cutting through the fog. The place felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding on to secrets, unwilling to let them go. As we reached the front porch, Josh laughed nervously, trying to shake off his fear. "Probably just rats and spiders in there," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. The door opened with a groan, revealing a hallway lined with dusty pictures, their frames tilted, the faces inside faded and unrecognizable. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from the shadows. We moved into the living room, where old furniture lay covered in dust and cobwebs. On a table in the corner, an old clock sat, stopped at exactly midnight. Its hands were frozen in place, a silent witness to whatever had happened here. "Let's check out the barn," Josh whispered, as if afraid to raise his voice. I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine. As we made our way to the barn, I noticed something strange. Animal tracks, but larger and deeper than any I'd ever seen. They led from the barn into the fields, disappearing into the fog. Maybe it's just an old horse, I tried to reassure myself, though I knew no horse left tracks like these. The barn was darker, colder, as if it held onto memories far older than the farmhouse. Our flashlights cast long shadows as we stepped inside, revealing piles of hay and old rusty equipment. But there was something else, something that made the air thick with dread, a set of large, empty animal pens with chains hanging from the walls, too strong and too secure to hold any ordinary livestock. What were they keeping here? Josh asked, his voice shaking slightly. We didn't have time to answer. From the far end of the barn, we heard a sound, a low, guttural growl, something between an animal and a human moan. We turned our flashlights in the direction of the noise, but the beam only reached so far into the darkness. The growling grew louder, and then just as quickly as it began, it stopped. Without thinking, we bolted out of the barn, slamming the door behind us. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing in around us. But what I saw next sent my heart racing. In the field, just beyond the barn, a figure stood, a man, or what looked like a man, tall and thin with limbs too long, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Did you see that?" I whispered, grabbing Josh's arm. He nodded, his face pale. "Let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but the path back to the farmhouse seemed longer, as if the farm itself was shifting, trying to keep us there. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered, following us with every step. Just when we thought we were clear, we heard footsteps behind us, slow and steady, crunching on the gravel path. "Don't look back," Josh whispered, but curiosity got the best of me. I turned, and there he was, the figure from the field, standing just a few yards away, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. It was as if he were trapped, bound to the farm, unable to escape. We ran the rest of the way to the farmhouse, slamming the door shut behind us. But the nightmare wasn't over. The moment we stepped inside, we heard the same low growling from the barn, this time closer, echoing through the empty halls. Desperate, we searched for a way out, but every door we tried seemed to lead us back to the living room, the stopped clock ticking faintly now, as if it were counting down to something. We could feel the walls closing in, the weight of Hollowfield's secrets pressing down on us, as though the farm itself was alive, feeding off our fear. Just when I thought we'd never escape, the front door creaked open, revealing a path through the fog. We didn't question it. We ran, not stopping until we reached Josh's car, parked just outside the property. When I looked back, the farmhouse stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But as we drove away, I could have sworn I saw the figure watching us from the fields, his glowing eyes following us, as if waiting patiently for our return. I haven't been back to Hollowfield Farm since, but sometimes on foggy nights, I can still hear that low growl echoing in my mind, a reminder that some places are better left alone. It was supposed to be a quick drive, a shortcut through the old highway that everyone said to avoid, but I was in a hurry to get home, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. As I turned onto the road, the headlights cut through the thick darkness, illuminating only a narrow stretch of cracked asphalt that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. There were no other cars, no lights, just me and the road. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of an empty road. There was an unnatural stillness, as if every living thing had vanished from the area. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of my engine and the distant, almost oppressive darkness that seemed to press in around me. A few miles in, I noticed something odd. Every now and then, in the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. But each time I turned to look, there was nothing there, just empty asphalt and shadows cast by my headlights. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But the unease grew stronger, settling like a weight in my chest. I turned on the radio to distract myself, but all I got was static. I switched channels, but nothing came through, just a low, distorted hum that grew louder and softer in waves, almost like breathing. A chill ran down my spine, and I switched it off, deciding it was better to endure the silence than whatever that sound was. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A car pulled over to the side, its headlights off and doors open. As I approached, I slowed down, wondering if someone needed help. But there was no movement, no sign of life, just an eerie, empty car in the middle of nowhere. Against my better judgment, I stopped and rolled down my window, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. The car was old and rusted, looking as though it had been abandoned for years. Yet there was something fresh, a suitcase lying open on the ground, clothes strewn around as if someone had left in a hurry. The strangest part was a single shoe lying next to the driver's door, the kind someone might drop if they were running. The chill deepened, and I decided to leave, pressing the gas a little harder this time. But as I drove away, my rearview mirror caught movement. A figure was standing in the middle of the road behind me, their face turned toward me, though I couldn't make out any details. My heart raced, but I kept driving, refusing to stop again. I tried to focus on the road, but my eyes kept darting to the mirror, and each time, the figure was closer, as if it was following me without actually moving. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. Yet no matter how fast I drove, the figure remained, getting clearer with each glance. Now I could make out their face, expressionless, blank, and staring directly at me. Suddenly the engine sputtered, and the car slowed, despite my foot pressing harder on the pedal. The headlights flickered, and my heart pounded as the car rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. I was stranded, with only the endless darkness and the figure growing nearer with each passing second. I tried to start the engine again, but it only whined, refusing to turn over. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, only to find that it had no signal. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the asphalt, growing louder, closer. I looked up, and the figure was there, right outside my window, staring at me with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all light. Their face was pale, lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Just the sound of breathing, harsh and rasping, as though they hadn't taken a breath in years. "Are you lost?" a voice whispered, though the figure's lips never moved. It sounded like it was coming from all around me, filling the car, pressing against my ears. I couldn't respond, paralyzed by fear as the figure reached a hand toward the window, fingertips brushing the glass. In a blind panic, I hit the door lock, even though I knew it wouldn't stop them. But just as their hand pressed against the window, the headlights flickered back on, and the engine roared to life. Without thinking, I slammed on the gas, speeding away from the figure as fast as I could. The road stretched endlessly, but I didn't dare stop. My heart pounded as I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still standing there watching. But the road was empty. The figure gone as if they'd never been there. After what felt like hours, the old highway finally ended, and I merged onto a main road, surrounded by the comforting glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car. But even as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, lingering just out of sight. To this day, I don't know who, or what I encountered on that lost highway. But every time I pass that road, I feel a familiar chill, as if the figure is still waiting, watching, ready for the next lost soul to stumble into their path. We had planned the trip for months, a weekend camping in the desert, far away from city lights and noise. Just me, my friends Amir, Youssef, and Khaled, sitting under the stars in the open night. The desert was known for its vast emptiness, stretching on for miles with nothing but sand dunes and the occasional rocky outcrop. We thought it would be the perfect spot to relax and stargaze, with no one else around for miles. We set up camp just before sunset, our tents arranged in a loose circle around a small fire pit. By the time night fell, the sky was a dark, endless dome of stars, brighter and more beautiful than any of us had ever seen. We laughed, talked, and watched the stars, feeling a kind of peace that only the desert could bring. It was Amir who first noticed the lights. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing out into the distance. I looked where he was pointing and saw nothing but darkness. "Probably just a plane or something," I said, trying to keep the mood light. But a few minutes later, Khaled spoke up, his voice tense. "Look, there it is again." This time I saw it too. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, a series of lights blinked on and off in a strange, shifting pattern. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. Not headlights or flashlights, not stars or satellites. The lights were bright but seemed to hover close to the ground, as if floating just above the sand. "Could be other campers," Youssef suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We hadn't seen a single soul on our way out here, and the chances of other campers choosing the same remote spot were slim. As we watched, the lights began to move, slowly drifting closer, shifting from one spot to another. They seemed to form strange shapes, almost like letters, twisting and spiraling in the darkness. The way they moved was unnatural, almost hypnotic, like they were calling to us. Khaled shivered. "This is creepy. Let's go back to the tents." But I couldn't look away, and neither could Amir or Youssef. It was like the lights held some kind of pull, compelling us to watch, as if there was something hidden in their movements, some pattern just beyond our understanding. Slowly, they drifted closer, moving in a line, as if they were searching for something, or someone. "We should go inside," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. I couldn't explain it, but a feeling of dread was creeping over me, an instinctive fear I couldn't shake. My friends nodded, and we retreated to our tents, though none of us felt comfortable enough to sleep. I lay there, listening to the silence, my heart pounding as I tried to ignore the strange lights. But the feeling that something was out there, watching us, wouldn't leave. After what felt like hours, I finally dozed off, only to be jolted awake by a faint, distant humming sound, like a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate through the sand and into my bones. Amir unzipped his tent, peeking out cautiously. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. We all did, though none of us could pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to be all around us, as if the desert itself were humming, calling. Unable to stand it any longer, we all stepped out of our tents, only to find the lights much closer than before. They were no longer distant, drifting specks. Now they hovered just a few hundred meters away, illuminating the sand in a soft, pale glow. We could see more clearly now that there were 5 of them, each one a different color: red, blue, green, yellow, and a deep, unsettling purple that seemed to absorb the darkness around it. They moved slowly, in perfect synchronization, as if they were alive, aware of our presence. The humming grew louder, almost unbearable, as the lights began to move closer, circling us in a way that felt almost predatory. "Get in the car!" Khaled shouted, panic breaking the silence. We sprinted to the car, not looking back, fumbling with the keys in our desperation to escape. Just as we piled in and slammed the doors, the lights reached the edge of our camp, hovering just outside the car's windows. I could feel the air buzzing with their presence, as if something unseen and ancient was studying us, deciding our fate. Amir jammed the key into the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering briefly as if something was draining the energy. The lights pressed closer, surrounding the car, filling the windows with their eerie, unnatural glow. Each light flickered and pulsed, moving in strange, almost hypnotic rhythms. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the lights stopped. For a long moment, they were still, as if considering us one last time. And then, without a sound, they floated upward, higher and higher, until they disappeared into the night sky, leaving nothing behind but silence and a lingering sense of dread. We sat there, too shaken to speak, until Khalid finally managed to start the car. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. We simply drove, wanting to put as much distance as possible between us and the strange lights. But as we drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Far behind us, hovering just above the desert floor, a single light blinked, faint but unmistakable. It was purple, the same unsettling color as before, and it was following us, keeping pace as if it hadn't finished with us yet. To this day, I can still feel that presence watching me, especially on quiet nights when the world is dark and silent. We never went back to the desert, but I sometimes wonder what those lights were and why they chose us. And sometimes, late at night, when I look out into the distance, I swear I can see a faint purple glow, waiting patiently, reminding me that some things in the desert are meant to remain a mystery. I knew the desert was dangerous at night, but the shortcut seemed like a good idea in the daylight. By the time the sun began to set, though, I was alone in the vast empty sands, and my car's wheels were stuck deep in the dunes. No matter how much I tried to push or dig, it only sank further, swallowed by the loose sand. I was stranded. The silence was complete, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind and my own frustrated muttering as I tried, again and again, to free the car. The temperature dropped as the last light faded, and soon I was left with nothing but the stars and my flashlight, casting a dim, weak glow onto the endless sand. After a while, the silence began to feel heavy, pressing in on me. But then, from somewhere far off in the darkness, I heard something strange, a faint, rhythmic sound. I froze, straining to listen. It was almost too faint to hear, but I was sure of it now. Distant drums, and a low, haunting voice singing a melody I couldn't quite understand. A shiver ran through me. I was alone, miles from anywhere. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here, especially not playing drums or singing. The song grew louder, drifting across the dunes like the wind. It was a strange tune, something old and hypnotic, each beat of the drum slow and steady, like a heartbeat. I climbed onto the car roof, hoping to see where the sound was coming from, but all I saw was darkness, stretching out to the horizon. The singing continued, growing closer now, a low, deep voice that sounded almost inhuman, as though it came from somewhere ancient and long forgotten. Every instinct told me to hide, but I couldn't look away. The drums thumped in an unsteady rhythm, echoing around me, and then, in the distance I saw them, a line of figures moving slowly through the desert, dressed in dark robes that seemed to flow and shimmer in the starlight. They carried torches, the flames flickering in a strange blue glow, illuminating their faces, which were hidden by hoods. I crouched lower on the car, hoping they wouldn't see me, my heart pounding in time with the drums. As they got closer, I could make out faint details. Their faces were painted in strange, geometric patterns, and each one held something in their hands, offerings of some sort. They were chanting, their voices rising and falling, filling the air with a sense of dread I couldn't escape. I tried to calm myself, thinking it had to be some sort of local ritual or a ceremony I didn't understand. But as they drew nearer, I realized that these weren't normal people. Their faces were too pale, their eyes hollow and empty, as if there was no life behind them, and they moved in a trance-like state, barely glancing around, their focus set on some unknown goal. The leader raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. They stood, facing the dune where my car was trapped, as if sensing my presence. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't notice me. But the leader's head tilted, and even from that distance, I felt his gaze settle on me. He began chanting louder, his voice rising above the drums, calling out words in a language I couldn't understand, yet which sent chills down my spine. The others joined in, their voices echoing across the sand, filling the night with an unearthly chorus. Suddenly, the ground beneath me started to shift. The sand moved like water, swirling around my car as if some unseen force was pulling it down. I scrambled to keep my footing, clutching the car roof as it tilted, sinking deeper with every passing second. The figures began to move again, circling around the dune, each step perfectly in sync with the beat of the drums. The sand continued to shift, dragging the car down into the depths. My flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, I thought I saw faces in the sand, twisted and hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. "Please help me," I shouted, though I knew it was useless. The figures ignored me, their chanting growing louder, more intense, as if they were calling to something beneath the sand. My voice was swallowed by the drums, lost in the endless rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Just as the car was almost entirely buried, the chanting stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, as the figures turned and began to walk away, disappearing one by one into the shadows. I was left alone, my car half buried, the sand still shifting beneath me, and then, from somewhere deep below, I heard it. A faint, low growl, echoing up through the sand. It was the sound of something ancient and hungry, something that had been awakened by the drums and the chanting. I scrambled out of the car, stumbling across the loose sand, desperate to put distance between me and whatever was beneath. But the sand was unstable, shifting beneath my feet, pulling me down with each step. The growling grew louder, a low, guttural sound that filled the air, as if the desert itself was alive and angry. I ran, not looking back, stumbling through the darkness as the ground continued to shake. The drums had stopped, but the song lingered in my mind, haunting and unrelenting, echoing with each step. Finally, as dawn broke, I reached the edge of the desert, collapsing in exhaustion. When I looked back, there was no sign of the figures or my car, only the endless empty dunes, silent and still. I never went back to that place, but sometimes in the quiet of the night, I can still hear the faint beat of those drums and the strange, haunting melody of the song, and I know that whatever lies beneath the desert sands is still there, waiting. After months of endless swiping, I finally matched with someone who seemed different. His profile was simple but intriguing. Just a few photos of him smiling, one of him hiking, and a couple of short lines. "Lover of quiet places. Let's talk about the stars." He looked unassuming, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the kind of person you wouldn't expect anything strange from. His name was Leo. Our first conversation was easy, almost too easy. Leo was attentive and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. We spent hours messaging each other about our lives, our favorite movies, and our dreams. He asked all the right questions, and after only a week, it felt like I'd known him for years. Then he suggested we meet up. He proposed a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place I'd never been to. It seemed a bit remote, but he assured me it was cozy and secluded, perfect for a private chat. I hesitated, but he insisted it was a favorite spot of his, a hidden gem he wanted to share with me. When I arrived, the cafe was empty, just as he said it would be. Leo was waiting at a table in the back, his face lighting up when he saw me. In person, he was just as friendly and soft-spoken as he had been online. We ordered coffee, and the conversation was even better face-to-face, natural and engaging. For a moment, I thought I might have found something real, but as we talked, small details started to make me uneasy. He knew things I hadn't told him, mentioning a book I'd been reading that I hadn't brought up, or referencing a trip I'd taken years ago. At first, I thought maybe I'd mentioned them in passing online and just forgotten. But then he brought up something more personal, something I'd never posted about. Remember that birthday party when you were little? The one with the pink dress? He asked, smiling. My stomach turned. I hadn't told anyone about that memory. It was a small, insignificant thing from when I was maybe 5 years old. How could he possibly know? Didn't you post about that once? He asked, quickly brushing it off, like it was no big deal. But I knew I hadn't. I hadn't posted about it anywhere. I laughed it off, though I was starting to feel uncomfortable. The rest of the evening he continued to bring up small personal details, each one making me feel more and more exposed. By the end of the night, I felt like he knew me better than some of my closest friends, and yet, I knew almost nothing about him. The next day, I decided to stop responding to his messages. I felt guilty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. For the next few days, I avoided the app, hoping he would lose interest. But then the messages started coming in through other accounts, first Instagram, then an email, each one more insistent. Hey, I haven't heard from you. Is everything okay? Just wanted to check in. I had a great time the other night. It didn't stop there. Soon I started noticing things around my apartment. My front door was left slightly open when I came home, even though I was sure I'd locked it. I found a small scratch on my living room window, like someone had tried to pry it open. And then, late one night, I saw a notification pop up on my phone, a photo message from an unknown number. My hands shook as I opened it. The photo was of me, sitting at my kitchen table, looking tired and distracted. It had been taken from outside through the window. I blocked the number, but the messages didn't stop. Photos of me walking to work, sitting in a cafe, even sleeping, each one from a new number, each one more invasive than the last. No matter how many times I blocked him, he always found a way through, always one step ahead. Finally, I called the police, but without any direct threats, they couldn't do much. They took my statement and told me to be careful, promising to keep an eye on my case. But the calls and messages continued, a constant reminder that he was always there, watching. One night, as I was lying in bed, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a photo. It was a voice message. Trembling, I pressed play. "I'm sorry if I scared you," Leo's voice said, calm and soft, like he was right there in the room with me. "I just wanted to know you, to really know you. We were so close, and now, you won't even talk to me." My heart raced as he continued, his voice growing colder, more detached. "You can't hide from me. You know that, don't you? I'll always be here, watching, waiting. You're mine." I deleted the message, but his voice haunted me. Every shadow seemed to hold his presence. Every stranger on the street felt like him in disguise. Days turned into weeks, and though the messages slowed, they never completely stopped. Sometimes late at night, my phone would buzz with a single text, just one word: "Miss you." To this day, I don't know where he is or how he keeps finding me, but every so often, when I see a shadow outside my window or a figure in the distance, I wonder if he's still there, waiting. And I know, deep down, that he's never really gone. After a rough breakup, I reluctantly decided to try dating apps again. It felt strange to put myself out there, but I figured a little distraction might help. I downloaded an app and started swiping through the usual profiles. Most of them were forgettable, but then I came across someone who made me stop. Her name was Alice, and she looked familiar in a strange, unsettling way. She didn't have a lot of photos, just a few, all taken in soft, dim lighting. Her profile was minimal, almost cryptic. "Looking for someone who really sees me." Intrigued, I swiped right, and within minutes, we matched. Our conversation started out casual. She seemed kind, funny, and oddly perceptive. She mentioned things I hadn't put in my profile, small details about me that surprised me. "You must love night walks," she said, almost like she knew. "Bet you prefer the quiet." We chatted for days, and each time I talked to her, she felt more familiar, as if she knew me better than I knew myself. Sometimes she'd mention things that were eerily accurate. Once she commented on my favorite childhood book. one I'd never talked about online. When I asked her how she knew, she laughed it off, saying she'd just had a feeling. Eventually, Alice suggested we meet up. I agreed, though the familiarity I felt was starting to seem strange. She suggested a spot, a small cafe in my neighborhood. "You know the one," she messaged. "The one with the green door." My stomach twisted. I'd never told her where I lived, but she'd described the cafe down the street perfectly. Still, I told myself it was just a lucky guess. I wanted to meet her in person and figure out why she felt so familiar. The day of the meetup, I arrived a little early and grabbed a table near the window. I waited, checking my phone and looking around, but she never showed. Just as I was about to leave, a message popped up. "Where are you going?" Alice texted. "I thought we were meeting." My skin prickled. I typed back, "I'm here at the cafe." "So am I," she replied. "Look outside." I glanced out the window, but the street was empty. Then I noticed someone standing a little further down the block, in the shadows. I couldn't make out their face, but they were watching me. "Is that you?" I texted, hoping for an explanation. But the reply that came back was simple. "Turn around." Dread pooled in my stomach. I slowly turned, expecting to see her standing behind me. But the cafe was empty. No one but me and the barista, who was distracted at the counter. Confused, I checked my phone again. She'd sent another message. "Look closer." "I'm right there." I stared around, feeling more unnerved by the second. Then, as I looked at the window again, I noticed something chilling. My reflection was wrong. It was me, but somehow not me. My face in the glass was distorted, smiling in a way I wasn't. The eyes were sharper, watching me in a way that felt hungry. My phone buzzed one last time. "See me now?" I dropped my phone and backed away from the window. The reflection, the version of me in the glass, tilted its head, mirroring me, but with an eerie, knowing grin. I ran out of the cafe, not daring to look at any reflective surface. I deleted the app as soon as I got home, but sometimes in the quiet of my apartment, I feel like something is watching. And every so often, when I catch a glimpse of myself in a mirror, I see that same strange smile, one I know I didn't make. It started as a dare. Macy, Emma, and Rachel had been friends for years, and they'd done their fair share of stupid things together. But tonight, Macy had an idea that made even Emma, the boldest of the group, pause. "Come on," Macy urged, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "We've been to this mall a million times, but have you ever been here after it closes?" Rachel laughed nervously. "You're kidding, right? Security would catch us in a heartbeat." But Macy shook her head. "We just hide out in the bathroom until they close up, and then we've got the whole place to ourselves. Just think about it. An empty mall, everything dark and spooky. It'll be like our own horror movie." Emma and Rachel exchanged a glance, the thrill of the idea slowly creeping into their minds. An empty mall at night, with no one around but themselves, did sound exciting, and a little terrifying. Finally, they agreed. After spending hours shopping and eating at the food court, the three girls slipped into the restroom as the closing announcement echoed through the mall. They huddled in one of the stalls, stifling giggles as they listened to the sounds of the mall staff locking up. Once silence fell, they waited a few more minutes before peeking out. The lights had dimmed, leaving only emergency lighting, casting long shadows through the empty corridors. The usually bright, bustling mall felt different now, eerily silent, like a giant waiting in the dark. They crept out of the bathroom, moving carefully down the corridors. Every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The hum of the air conditioning, the clink of a loose floor tile, the occasional creak that made them freeze. They passed store after store, some with lights dimmed, others with displays lit up in a soft, eerie glow. In one of the clothing stores, a line of mannequins stood by the front window, frozen in perfect poses. Emma snickered and posed like one of them, her arms stiff and awkward. "Welcome to the midnight fashion show," she whispered, striking exaggerated poses. Rachel laughed, but Macy just shushed them, a serious look on her face. "Don't be too loud. You don't want to wake them up," she said. half jokingly. "Wake them up," Emma scoffed, rolling her eyes. "They're mannequins, Macy. It's not like they're—" A soft thud echoed through the mall. They froze, listening, their eyes wide as they scanned the shadows. Another thud, this time closer, like the sound of something heavy falling. "Maybe it's just security," Rachel whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. They walked slowly down the hallway, trying to keep their footsteps light. As they neared the center of the mall, Macy stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on a mannequin display near the escalator. One of the mannequins, a woman in a red dress, seemed to have shifted. Its head was tilted slightly, as if looking right at them. "Wasn't that facing the other way?" Macy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emma shrugged it off. "You're just freaking yourself out. It was probably always like that." She reached out to touch it, just to prove her point. But as her hand neared the mannequin's face, it twitched. Emma pulled her hand back, stumbling. "Did you see that?" she stammered. The mannequin's face was as still as stone, but something about it felt different. Its eyes seemed sharper, as if it was actually looking at them. They all took a step back, nervously glancing around. And that's when they heard it. The sound of a soft scraping, like plastic dragging against the floor. They turned and saw another mannequin, this one dressed in a dark suit, standing in the middle of the hallway. None of them had heard it move, but it had definitely been further down the corridor just moments ago. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Macy, normally the brave one, looked pale. "Maybe we should just go back to the bathroom and wait until morning." They turned to go back, but the mannequin in the red dress was now blocking their path. It was standing closer than before, one arm outstretched as if reaching for them. Its expression was still frozen, but there was something malicious in the way it was posed, like it was daring them to come closer. Heart pounding, Macy grabbed Rachel's arm. "Let's go around." They moved down a different hallway, trying to find another way out. But with every corner they turned, it seemed like there was another mannequin, each one posed differently, as if waiting for them. Some of them were lying on the floor, limbs twisted in strange angles, their blank faces pointed toward the girls. Others stood at attention, eyes seeming to follow them. Then they heard footsteps, light but distinct. They spun around, only to see that one of the mannequins was now standing just a few feet away, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The footsteps came again, echoing down the empty halls, closer and closer, but it wasn't a security guard or anyone else they could see. It was as if the mannequins themselves were coming to life, moving just out of sight, their plastic limbs scraping and thudding against the floor. Panicking, they broke into a run, but no matter which way they turned, the mannequins seemed to appear out of nowhere, blocking their path. Finally, they found themselves cornered in a small clothing store. They slammed the door shut, pressing themselves against it, listening as the scraping sounds grew louder outside. "Are they trying to get in?" Rachel whispered, eyes wide with terror. Just then, a soft tapping came from the other side of the door. They held their breath, not daring to move. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, like a deliberate knock. Suddenly, the door handle started to turn. Emma grabbed a clothing rack, pushing it against the door as the handle twisted and rattled. The mannequins were trying to get in, their blank faces pressed against the glass, peering in at the girls, their hands scratching at the window. "Why are they doing this?" Macy cried, her voice breaking. They're just supposed to be things." As if in response, one of the mannequins tilted its head, almost like it was amused. Then, with a shudder, it pressed harder against the glass, the entire door starting to shake under its weight. And then, just as suddenly, everything went quiet. They waited, their breaths ragged, not daring to move. Slowly, Emma peered through a gap in the clothing rack, but the mannequins were gone. The hall outside was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. The girls stumbled out of the store, desperate to find a way out. They finally spotted an emergency exit sign, sprinting toward it with every ounce of strength they had. They burst through the door and into the parking lot, the cold night air hitting their faces. When they looked back, the mall was still, its windows dark and empty. But as they stood there, catching their breath, Macy thought she saw a figure in one of the windows, a mannequin, watching them with that same cold, unblinking stare. They never spoke of that night again, but each of them knew they'd never look at a mannequin the same way. And sometimes, when they passed by a store window, they swore they could see a mannequin's head turn just slightly, its eyes following them, as if remembering their faces. Weeks passed since the night in the mall, but for Macy, Emma, and Rachel, the terror had left a scar they couldn't shake. They tried to pretend everything was fine, pushing it to the back of their minds, but each of them had started to notice strange things in their daily lives. It began with Macy. One evening, while Macy was home alone, she noticed something odd. Her bedroom mirror, which she'd carefully decorated with photos and postcards, had something new stuck to the frame, a small, plain tag, the kind you'd see attached to clothing. It was blank, except for a single word printed in black: sale. She tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe it had gotten mixed up with her shopping. But as she peeled it off the mirror, a chill ran down her spine. She could have sworn she hadn't seen it there before, and something about it felt intentional, like a message left just for her. The next night, she found another tag, this time on the window by her front door. Again, it read, sale, with no explanation of how it had gotten there. Macy's heart pounded as she threw it away. But the next morning when she checked the trash, the tag was gone. Rachel's experience was different. She was shopping at a clothing store, trying to distract herself, when she noticed something strange. As she browsed the racks, she glanced toward a group of mannequins at the front of the store. One of them wore a red dress, the red dress from the night at the mall. Her hands went cold as she recognized its pose, one arm reaching out as if inviting her closer. Fighting the urge to run, she took a shaky step forward. That's when she saw the mannequin's hand. Instead of smooth plastic, the fingers were scratched and marked, as if it had clawed its way out of something. Rachel stumbled back, nearly knocking over a rack. A sales associate came over, concerned, but when she tried to point out the mannequin, she found it had somehow returned to a normal, unthreatening pose. Emma's experiences were even more unnerving. She'd started hearing soft footsteps outside her apartment at odd hours of the night. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, until one night they stopped right outside her door. She held her breath, clutching her phone, but when she looked through the peephole, no one was there. But the worst came when she noticed her reflection in the hallway mirror. For a moment she thought she saw her own eyes staring back with an unblinking intensity that wasn't hers, the same look she'd seen on the mannequins that night. She blinked, and the expression disappeared, but the memory lingered, haunting her every time she passed by a mirror. After weeks of these incidents, the girls decided to meet up. They gathered at a coffee shop, each of them pale, exhausted, and on edge. As they shared their experiences, they realized their encounters all traced back to that night in the mall. The mannequins hadn't just scared them. They'd left a piece of themselves in each of the girls' lives, following them in subtle, terrifying ways. Desperate for answers, Macy suggested they go back to the mall. It seemed insane, but they couldn't escape the feeling that the mannequins were somehow calling them back. They needed to end whatever nightmare had started that night. They returned to the mall just before closing, their nerves frayed. As the mall emptied and the lights dimmed, the silence settled in around them. They made their way to the clothing store where they'd first seen the mannequin in the red dress, hearts pounding with every step. Inside the store, the mannequins stood as they always had, cold, unfeeling. But this time, as they watched in horror, the mannequins began to shift, their faces contorting into eerie expressions. The one in the red dress raised its arm, pointing directly at them. Then the lights flickered out. In the darkness, they heard it, the soft scrape of plastic against the floor, the sound of mannequins moving in the shadows. Panic set in as they tried to run, but the exit seemed to stretch farther away with each step. The mannequins closed in, their expressions frozen in silent screams. As the lights flickered back on, Macy, Emma, and Rachel found themselves surrounded, unable to move. Each mannequin stared at them with unblinking eyes, trapping them in a circle. In a final, desperate whisper, Emma asked, "What do you want from us?" But there was no answer. Only the cold, empty gaze of the mannequins, reflecting back their own terror. And in the stillness, a chilling thought took hold. They'd never left that night in the mall. They were part of it now, just 3 more faces in the mannequin display. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. I'd left the city around midnight, trying to make good time through the empty stretches of desert highway, with miles and miles of nothing but sand and dark skies. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I noticed I was running low on gas. The needle dipped just below the quarter tank mark, and I started looking for a place to fill up. Finally, after miles of deserted road, a small gas station appeared in the distance, illuminated by a single flickering neon sign that simply read, "Gas." It looked ancient, the kind of place that probably hadn't seen many customers in years. But with no other options, I pulled in, grateful for the sight of civilization, no matter how run down. The place was eerily silent. There was no sound but the low hum of the overhead lights and the occasional creak of the wind against the old metal signs. I got out of the car, shivering slightly as the desert night air bit into me. The pumps looked like relics from another era, and the whole place smelled faintly of dust and something I couldn't quite place. I glanced around, but there didn't seem to be anyone working. Still, the pump clicked on, as if sensing my presence, and I started filling my tank. The silence was so complete that I could hear the liquid flowing into my car, every drop echoing against the emptiness around me. As I waited, I looked around and noticed a strange shape near the side of the building. It looked like a person, hunched over, facing away from me. At first I thought it might be an employee or maybe a homeless person, but something about the way they were crouched didn't seem right. They were completely still. Too still. Almost as if they weren't breathing. Trying to shake off the unease, I focused on my car, but my mind kept drifting back to that figure. When I looked back, they were gone. The empty space where they'd been made my skin crawl. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps, coming from around the side of the building. My pulse quickened as I strained to see who, or what, was coming. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, warping around the edge of the building. A voice broke the silence, low and barely a whisper. "Need help with something?" I jumped, my heart racing, and spun around. An old man stood behind me, wearing a dirty gas station uniform, his eyes half hidden beneath a tattered baseball cap. He looked as if he'd been working here for decades, with deep lines etched into his face and a distant glazed look in his eyes. No, I'm good," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just getting gas." He nodded slowly, but his gaze never left me. There was something wrong about him. The way he just stood there, watching, unblinking. And when he finally spoke, his words made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You know, people shouldn't be out here this late," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Strange things happen, especially around this place." I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the tension. "Just passing through. I'll be out of here in a minute." He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, as if listening to something far off in the distance. His face took on a strange expression, like he was seeing something I couldn't. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the building, disappearing around the corner. Relieved that he was gone, I hurried to finish filling my tank. I put the pump back and went to pay, hoping the interaction would be quick. As I opened the door to the station's small convenience store, a bell chimed, and I walked in. The inside was as dusty and run down as the rest of the place. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows over shelves stocked with expired snacks and faded cans of soda. But the thing that caught my attention was the row of photographs lining the wall behind the counter. They were old, black and white pictures of people standing in front of the gas station, smiling for the camera. Except, the smiles didn't look quite right. They were too wide, too forced, almost like they were grimaces. And in each picture, the same old man was there, standing off to the side, his expression vacant and hollow. Some of the pictures looked decades old, but he didn't appear to have aged a day. My skin prickled as I realized he was in every single photo. A soft, raspy voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "Looking for someone?" I turned to see a woman standing behind the counter, her face hidden in shadow. Her voice sounded almost like a hiss, dry and cracked, as if she hadn't spoken in years. Her eyes were dark, empty pits that seemed to swallow the dim light around her. Just paying for gas," I managed to say, trying not to look too long at those eyes. She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. "You're not from around here, are you?" I shook my head, feeling the weight of her stare pressing down on me. She reached under the counter, pulling out an old leather-bound book. Without saying a word, she opened it to a blank page and slid it toward me, along with a pen. "Sign here," she said, her voice low and commanding. What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Just sign," she repeated, her tone final. "It's for our records." The pen felt heavy in my hand, but something inside me screamed not to do it. My instinct took over, and I dropped the pen, shaking my head. "I don't think I need to sign anything. I just paid for gas." For the first time, her expression changed. She frowned, her eyes narrowing. "Suit yourself," she said coldly, "but don't expect to leave so easily." Ignoring the creeping dread, I turned and bolted for the door. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock the door. Behind me, I heard the old woman's voice, her words chilling me to the core. "Everyone who stops here always comes back." The car roared to life, and I sped out of the lot, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The gas station quickly faded into the distance, swallowed up by the darkness. I drove for hours, not daring to look back. But as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I realized something was wrong. The gas gauge, which had been full when I left the station, was now dropping, faster than it should have. Confused and terrified, I kept driving, hoping to make it to the next town. But as the sun rose, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Up ahead, standing on the side of the road, was a small, run-down gas station, its neon sign flickering with the single word, gas. It was the same station. I slammed on the brakes, staring in disbelief. I hadn't turned around, hadn't taken any exits, yet somehow I was back. And standing in front of the station, waiting, were the old man and the woman, their faces twisted into those strange, unnatural smiles from the photos. They waved at me, beckoning me closer, and as the needle on my gas gauge dipped toward empty, I realized I had no choice. Jenna was used to receiving gifts from her fans. After all, she was one of TikTok's rising stars, with millions of followers who adored her dances, lip syncs, and story times. Gifts were part of her daily life, from fan art and letters to cute trinkets. But one day, she received something unusual, a doll. The box was delivered to her home address, which was strange since she'd only shared her P.O. box with fans. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was an old-fashioned porcelain doll. It was beautiful in an eerie way. The doll had delicate features, curly black hair, and wore a small faded dress with lace details. But its most unsettling feature was its eyes. Large, glassy, and almost too real, like it was watching her. A note was tucked under the doll's arm. In shaky handwriting it read, "To Jenna, my favorite. Keep her close, she's always watching out for you." Jenna shrugged it off, thinking it was just an overly enthusiastic fan. She decided it would make a good prop for a TikTok. She set up her phone and recorded a quick unboxing video, laughing about how creepy the doll looked. Her followers loved it, flooding the comments with jokes about haunted doll vibes. She made a few more videos with it, giving the doll a name, Luna, and putting it in the background of her live streams. But after a few days, strange things began happening. It started small. She'd leave Luna on her bedroom shelf only to find her in different spots. Sometimes the doll's head would be turned, its glassy eyes staring at the door as if waiting for her. One night she swore she heard faint giggling, but when she got up to check, her apartment was empty. The doll began to feel heavier somehow. Whenever she picked it up, it felt colder, like it had been left outside in the winter chill. Then one night, she woke up to the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. She opened her eyes, and there, at the foot of her bed, was Luna. The doll's face was tilted, and its eyes seemed to gleam in the darkness. A chill ran down Jenna's spine. She was sure she hadn't left the doll in her bedroom. She threw it back onto the shelf and tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. The next night, the tapping returned. She tried to ignore it, pulling her covers over her head. But then she heard a voice, barely a whisper. "Jenna, I'm here." Her heart raced. She looked around the room, her breath quickening. The doll wasn't on the shelf. It was on her nightstand, its glassy eyes staring directly at her. Panicking, Jenna grabbed her phone and recorded herself. She'd built her fame by sharing her life. So she decided to go live, thinking maybe her followers could reassure her that it was just her mind playing tricks. She told her audience what had been happening, showing them the doll and laughing nervously, trying to brush it off. But the comments told a different story. People started pointing out something she hadn't noticed. "Look closer," one comment read. "There's something in its eyes." Jenna zoomed in on the doll's face and her blood ran cold. Reflected in the glassy eyes was her own room, and in the background, a shadowy figure standing just behind her. She whipped around, but the room was empty. Her followers were spamming the chat, saying they'd seen the figure move. She tried to end the stream, her hands shaking, but her phone wouldn't respond. The screen froze, and the last thing she saw before it went black was the doll's face, staring directly into the camera, its mouth curving into the faintest of smiles. Jenna threw the doll into a box and stuffed it into her closet, determined to forget it. But that night she heard soft footsteps pacing outside her door, a faint whisper calling her name over and over. The next morning she opened the closet and, to her horror, the box was empty. The doll was gone. She packed her things and moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. She tried to delete her account, but every time she thought about going live, a message would appear on her screen. "I'm still watching, Jenna. I'll always be watching." And no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, Jenna always felt the weight of those glassy eyes watching her, waiting for the moment she'd look back. I was halfway through a long, lonely drive across state lines, cutting through empty back roads, when my gas gauge dipped to almost empty. My GPS showed no major towns for miles, but a small dot on the map marked something called Hollow Road Gas Station, not too far ahead. Relieved, I decided to give it a shot, figuring it was better than risking a breakdown in the middle of nowhere. I reached the place just as the last light of dusk was fading. It looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. A single old pump under a rusted canopy, and a small convenience store with faded, flickering lights. An eerie sense of silence surrounded the area, broken only by the occasional wind rustling through the trees nearby. As I pulled up to the pump, a single light over the entrance to the convenience store flickered to life. I stepped out, feeling the cold creep into my bones. I went to grab the pump handle, but a hand fell on my shoulder, startling me. Turning around, I saw a man in an old gas station uniform, the kind you'd expect from the 1950s, with a name patch that read, Gary. He looked normal at first glance, just an older guy, with thinning hair and a tired look in his eyes. "Need some gas?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse as though he hadn't spoken in a while. "Yeah," I said, feeling a bit uneasy. "Just enough to get me to the next town." Gary nodded, then, without another word, he lifted the pump handle and started filling up my car for me. I watched him work, noticing how his eyes darted around, as if he was constantly checking for something just out of sight. "Not many folks stop here these days," he muttered, his gaze still shifting around the empty lot. "Is that so?" I replied, trying to make small talk. But his words were unsettling. As the tank filled, he looked at me with an odd expression. "Listen," he said quietly. "Whatever you do, don't look in the windows of the store." I blinked, caught off guard. All right, why not? Gary's face tensed. Just trust me. You don't want to see what's inside. His voice was barely more than a whisper. I forced a chuckle, trying to mask my nerves. Sure thing, I said, pretending not to be rattled. But now, of course, I was curious. I couldn't stop my eyes from drifting toward the store, the glass windows dark and clouded. Before I knew it, Gary was done filling my tank. He closed the gas cap and gave me a stiff nod, his face pale under the dim light. I thanked him, handed him a few bills, and climbed back into my car, deciding I'd drive straight out of there without looking back. But as I turned the ignition, something caught my eye. A movement, faint and ghostly, inside the store. Against my better judgment, I glanced at the windows. The lights inside flickered on, revealing what looked like people. At first I thought they were mannequins, propped up in awkward poses, frozen mid-motion. But then one of them moved. I froze, my heart pounding. The figure inside had its back to me, wearing an old dusty coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Slowly, it turned its head, and even from the car, I could feel its gaze fix on me. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull me in. I tore my gaze away, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I glanced back at Gary, but he was gone, nowhere to be seen. My brain screamed at me to leave, to get out of there as fast as possible. But my body was frozen, paralyzed by the thought of what I'd just seen. A knock on the passenger window jolted me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Turning, I saw Gary standing there, looking frantic. He gestured for me to roll down the window. Hesitantly, I lowered it an inch. "Didn't I tell you not to look?" he hissed, his eyes wild. "Once they see you, they don't forget. They'll follow you now, you understand? You need to leave. Now." I didn't need any more convincing. With a final nod, I slammed my car into gear and pulled out of the station, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the road. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The figures from inside the store were now standing in the parking lot, staring after me. There were 3 of them, all with the same empty, hollow eyes, their heads tilted at odd angles. And Gary, he was there too, standing among them, his expression blank, as if he'd never spoken to me at all. I forced my gaze back to the road, heart racing as I sped faster, desperate to get as far away from that place as possible. But a deep, gnawing fear crept into my mind. What if they weren't just at the gas station? After miles of empty road, the adrenaline began to fade, and I started to feel foolish, wondering if my mind had played tricks on me. But just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, my headlights flickered, casting long shadows on the deserted road. And in those shadows I saw them. Standing along the edge of the road, scattered at intervals, were those same figures, still, unmoving, and watching. Their faces were blank and expressionless, their hollow eyes fixed on me as I sped past. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe they were just trees or posts or anything but what I feared. But they didn't stop appearing. Every few minutes, another figure would come into view, standing just at the edge of the darkness, watching. Eventually, I stopped looking. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight, my knuckles turned white. I drove for hours, not stopping until the first light of dawn broke the horizon. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled over at a diner, my nerves frayed and my body exhausted. I stumbled inside, ordered a coffee, and tried to collect myself. But as I sipped my drink, I felt a strange, familiar chill run down my spine. I looked out the window and my heart sank. Across the street, standing under the flickering neon lights of an old motel, was a single figure in a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes hollow and unseeing. And as the sun rose, I realized with growing dread that they had followed me all the way here. No matter where I go, I'll never be alone again. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey tonight. I hope you found a sense of peace and comfort. Before you fully drift off, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and from which country are you watching? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more captivating stories. Until we meet again, rest deeply and may your dreams be sweet.